Well, hello everyone. It's Martin Lush here, President of NSF Health Sciences, the Pharma Biotech division. Warm welcome to everyone to our May free webinar on changing behaviours. By way of introduction, well, by now you all know me. I'm President of, as I said, the Pharma Biotech division of NSF. And NSF is a fairly unique organisation in that we're a not-for-profit organisation, really with one objective in everything we do, which is to actually protect human health around the world. So, you know, whether it's my colleagues working in food or in water or analysis and testing or in medical devices or indeed here in Pharma Biotech, what really drives us is to help your businesses improve so you can actually deliver the medicines that really make a difference, but also to help prepare you to be more resilient in an environment that is changing and challenging all of the time. The webinar program that many of you I know all participated in is really focused very much on delivering information that is of value in a world that is changing all of the time. So the whole objective of this program of webinars for 2015 was to be what I guess I call a forward-thinking agenda to say, look, if you do these things really, really well, you'll actually survive in an environment that is incredibly challenging. And thanks, Bob, for your well wishes. Am I feeling better after the aborted attempt at my last webinar back in April? Apologies for any inconvenience caused, ladies and gentlemen. I had the pleasure of being in Paris in springtime the week before that webinar. It was work rather than pleasure. And I went to an exquisite restaurant and clearly made the wrong risk-based decision in terms of menu choice, and I suffered as a result of that. So I am now fully recovered. I've learnt from the mistake, which goes back to our session on CAPA effectiveness, reducing repeat deviations, and I certainly wouldn't choose that choice again. But thanks, Bob, I'm fully recovered. Anyway, that session is going to run on the 18th of May. I promise not to eat anything within 48 hours of commencing that, so I don't disappoint you guys. But the subject of this webinar is a really fascinating area, I think at least, which is how do we go about changing behaviours actually in the workplace. The usual essentials, everyone. The session is being recorded. It will be available for you to download and share, so you can actually spread the word. Please, if you need any more information after this session, just contact me on the usual contact details there. What I present, really try and get as much across in the time we have available, but inevitably I can't cover everything. What I'm about to present, it reflects a summary, I guess, of a sort of 2 to 3 day workshop on this really, really important behaviour or session on how to change behaviours. As always, I will answer all of your questions, but because my very simple brain can't multitask, I found it really quite difficult reading the chat features, the questions that come through there, and concentrating on delivery. But as you all know, any questions that come through, I will individually get back to you and answer all of those questions. And for all of the other webinars, I've had various calls and conference calls and sessions with many of you just to ensure that all of your questions actually get answered. So for this session, everyone, my promise to you in terms of what you will learn is, why behaviours must change. Our industry now is facing huge challenges, and unless we do things differently, we're going to be even more challenged. And there are certain things we need to completely refocus on, in my opinion. When it comes to behaviour change, I think many of us are experienced enough to know what works and what doesn't. So we'll just briefly explore those areas, and then we'll really get on to what influences behaviour. quite a complex subject and not necessarily easy to get over in sort of 45 minutes, but I'm going to give you a really high-level review before getting into the process for changing behaviours and walking you through a process that works by actually giving you a very simple case study to attach meaning to, so you can see how these various tools and techniques have been applied and can be applied in your workplace. And finally, as always, the objective of these sessions is to give you enough information and hopefully inspire you to use that information in really going out there and influencing others so that we can continue to do our jobs as effectively as possible. I said earlier, the world is changing and therefore behaviours need to be not just aligned to those changes but in advance of those changes. Now, at NSF, we have lots of people that lots of our consultants that going out and doing various audits, extremely busy with work around remediation, all of which is saying there are still companies that are failing to, for example, move from a behavioural habit of firefighting to one of prevention and improvement. So many companies wrapped up in complexity rather than changing that behaviour into how do we simplify. Changing behaviours from a compliance focus to one that is patient focused. Moving from a behavioural habit of training to one of education. Moving from reactionary risk assessment or risk assessments to value-adding risk management. Behavioural change from invisible leadership to one of visibility. And we can go on and on and on. I think, we all look around us today and understand and absorb the various pressures that we're all under in the industry. And I think we all accept, look, insanity is defined as doing the same thing and expecting a different result. So if we want a different result, we need to change the way that we tackle things. And that's not changing SOPs, it's not changing systems, although they play an important part, but it's actually changing the underpinning behaviours. Now, when it comes to behavioural change, ladies and gentlemen, one really important thing, one key step, the first step, is to really identify and nail down, so to speak, the specific behaviour you want to change. And I've given you here some pretty simple, straightforward behaviours where, could be, how do I improve hand washing? How do I reduce missing signatures? How do I improve poor aseptic practice or poor housekeeping or poor dress discipline? The key thing in behavioural change is really being as specific as you can when it comes to identifying that behaviour which is no longer suitable, no longer fit for purpose. Never, please, never ever say we've just got to improve GMP compliance. It's not specific enough, it's not focused enough, and it really doesn't give the brain enough to attach itself to when it really comes to changing that behaviour. Now, I said earlier, ladies and gentlemen, that behavioural change is complex. Well, I all like a very simple life, and I guess if you were to boil down behaviour into a very simple equation, for me it's this. Behaviour, the way we act and behave, is down to three factors, or it's made up of three elements. One is the motivation to change. Secondly is the ability to change whatever we decide. And then thirdly, and most importantly, it's then habituating that new behaviour so that it is stronger than the old one, and we are able to do that behaviour automatically no matter what the external pressures are. Now, that is a gross oversimplification of behaviour, But I think it's always useful to have a very simple definition in our minds, because then as we go about our day-to-day jobs, we have something to attach to. Now, if you look at each one of these, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of what it really does mean, the motivational aspect of behavioural change is really another way of saying we've got to give people a reason for caring. When anybody tries to change anything, the reptilian part of our brain that we've discussed so often in the past is asking these types of questions of each one of us if we are the recipient of that request to change. What's in it for me? Why should I bother, frankly? I'm quite happy doing what I am doing. Why on earth would I do something that is completely strange and therefore painful? What difference will this new behaviour make? And what difference will I make if it becomes routine? What could go wrong if I don't? What are the risks associated with, sticking with what I know? And importantly, what is the context? What is the big picture? How does this new behaviour fit in with what I am currently doing? People can't be forced to do things they don't want to do, at least do consistently. We can all kid ourselves that when we ask for behavioural change, or when we tell people how key it is for a different way of working, sure, they'll do it for maybe the first or second day. They'll probably do it when supervisors and managers are standing looking over their shoulders. But when the pressure is on and supervision is absent, that old behaviour, 9 times out of 10, will actually return. And one of the reasons it often does is because we spend too little time providing the motivation, providing a reason for people to care so they can be bothered to go through what is a very painful process, ditching one old behaviour to adapt a new one. So motivation is key. Secondly, as we said, the A, that stands for providing people with the ability to do what we now want them to do. And that is down to the education and knowledge, that's the why, as well as the skills regarding the how. We also need to provide the tools, the systems and the procedures to enable them to execute new behaviour, practice the new behaviour, make mistakes with the new behaviour so they can learn from it and refine those skills so that it becomes the habit, which we'll talk about in a minute. The ability component also means that we've got to work really hard removing barriers that prevent that new skill, that new behaviour from being adopted. And then finally, we need to habituate. For those of you, and most of you actually participated in the last webinar, where we sort of looked at the habit, the process of quality habits. We discussed the habit loop, and thank you for your very positive feedback on that session. For those of you that didn't, or you want to be reminded, there is the direct link to that webinar, because during that webinar we said, look, quality culture is defined by our quality habits, which by definition are those things people do without even consciously thinking about them, no matter how much pressure the external environment is putting upon people. We still do the right thing. We still practice those habits. And we talked about that habit loop, the cue or trigger, the routine, and the reward. So, at a really simple level, ladies and gentlemen, behavior really comes down to, are people motivated to change? Do they have the ability to change? And have we really taken the time, and it does take time, to habituate those new behaviors so that they do become automatic? And as you look at that M, A, and H, it's worthy of just taking a few seconds to reflect on those behavioral change initiatives that have failed, and actually ask you, well, which component of that equation was the weakest? Was it the motivation? Did we just focus too much on the how, a very small component of the ability section? Or did we do all of that, but frankly give insufficient time and importance to the practicing and practicing and practicing of that new behavior. So when we start looking at changing behaviors, keep that B equals M, A, and H in your mind and really start paying a lot of attention to each of those, particularly the motivation aspects, because when people are motivated to change and they're given a reason that is deeply personal for caring, then you'll be amazed at what people can do and can do very, very successfully. So life isn't that simple, however. You know, that B equals M, A, and H is a real crystallization of what is a fascinating area, because behavior, as we all know, is determined by a number of factors. It's certainly determined by what goes on between our ears, you know, the psychological factors, our conscious as well as our subconscious thinking. Behavior is also influenced by cultural factors. You know, this can always be a tricky one because every company has a particular culture. That culture can be influenced by the country or the nationality that the organization is based upon. And then finally, organizational factors, the way our leaders behave, the way our systems drive certain behaviors, the way our processes and procedures drive certain behaviors, all have a part to play. Now, we're really serious about behavioral change and taking that simple B equals M, A, and H equation and making a change. We've really got to take into account the psychological, cultural, as well as organizational factors. And we'll talk about that a little more. But it's one thing that is worth emphasizing is that you can have really great understanding of what goes on between our ears, but unless you change the organization, for example, making SOPs easier to follow or processes less error prone, often the behaviors that we want to change cannot be changed because the systems and organizations prevent them from doing so. Now, I was on a call this morning, ladies and gentlemen, just before this webinar with a client who's asked for a repeat session on our human error prevention course. And the session that we're designing with this client is actually targeted towards reducing documentation errors. The target audience is operators and technicians, so people who are normally blamed for the errors and mistakes. And the question I posed to the client, the leadership team, was this: look, I can stand up and talk to people about how to simplify their recipes, how to simplify their batch manufacturing records. That is easy, but then enabling these people to change, to reduce the complexity of the SOPs, to reduce the complexity of the change control system, unless those actions take place, you will not improve their behavior when it comes to, in this case, missing signatures or calculation errors. So often companies over complex documentation and quality systems, often aided by the KPIs that the cultural factors within the company drive, all result in a behavior that is not the one that we want. So we want to have a behavior that is different. We've got to really get into understanding what the heck is driving that behavior in the first instance, because most people get out of bed in the morning to do the best they can with what they have got. And the job of leadership, which is, I know, the role that many of you have, is to ensure that you facilitate that. And certainly when I was in the industry, I looked upon my role as being, I guess, akin to the lubricant in a car engine, something that enables the bits to run smoothly and with less resistance. Now, I said that MAH equation was actually an oversimplification. For those of you that know me well, you know my passion for mind maps. My son says this is a sign of a tortured mind, by the way, but this is a master mind map that I have used for a number of sessions where we get into the detail of behavioural change. And as with most of my mind maps, they need to be explained. We don't have time to go into each of these. But you can see right at 12 o'clock on the mind map that very simple explanation of behaviour, motivation, ability, and habits. You can then see all of the psychological aspects that influence the way in which people behave, the cultural aspects at 6 o'clock, and then the organisational aspects that influence behaviour on the left-hand side of the mind map. Now, in the session that I run, I give clients a diagnostic tool so that they can actually evaluate each one of these in turn, so that they can understand whether the behaviours they're experiencing are more to do with the organisation, more to do with the cultural aspects, or indeed more to do with the psychological aspects. But anyway, that's just sort of share with you that piece of, well, I think it's art, but I guess many of you thinking it probably is the sign of a tortured mind. But that just gives you an understanding of the complexity, but the synergy that exists between each one of those elements. Now, my promise to you was all of these. One area that we haven't covered is, well, we know what works and we know what doesn't work. And certainly in my experience, things like, okay, we're going to give you more training, or we're going to take disciplinary action, or we're going to put in some extra checks, or we're going to add a few more lines to an already complicated SOP or batch record so that the behavior changes. Well, I think we all know those actions, what I call window dressing. They might give the illusion of progress, but actually achieve nothing when it comes to behavioural change. Now, what I want to do, ladies and gentlemen, is to give you some, in the short time that we've got, some, I've called them your 5 to drive. If you're going to do 5 things when it comes to behavioural change, these are the 5 things, and in this order, you're going to execute with precision and in detail. Number 1, we've mentioned already, identify the specific behaviour you want to change. Number 2 is often missed out. People identify a behaviour and say, okay, that's no longer fit for purpose. What we want you to do is X, but without actually understanding why they are doing the original behaviour in the first place. And understanding what drives the old behaviour is really, really important. And the emphasis there is on understanding, not judging people or criticizing people, but actually stepping into their world, into their shoes to say, okay, let's understand the reasons why. Because once we've understood those reasons, we can actually go some way to constructing and engineering in a new behavior that works. Number 3 is then, okay, we've then got to provide that all-important motivation for the new behavior. Then we've got to focus on making sure everybody has the ability to implement that new behavior. And then we've got to make sure through the habituation process that they do it day in and day out, no matter what pressures they are actually under. So what I've done here, ladies and gentlemen, is to give you an example of a client I was with some months ago who said, Martin, and this came up in our workshop on behavioural change. And as with all of our workshops, it was customized for their particular needs. And I said to them, okay, give me behavior. Let's start simple. Don't just say, we want to improve attitude to risk or behaviors to risk or behaviors to change control. Let's just start simple, get our competencies in place and practice those so that we can actually then tackle those bigger, more challenging projects. So they said to me, well, Martin, the problem we've had for a long time now, is in our Class A and B areas in sterile manufacturing, we still struggle with getting consistency in practice with sanitizing gloves. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with sterile manufacturing, in the highly controlled Class A, which for all intents and purposes is sterile, it is really, really important that the gloved hands of the gowned operators are sanitized on a very, very regular basis. Usually, every time an operator leaves the grade A to move into the grade B, they sanitize their hands. That is what we call good aseptic practice. And what they said to me was, Martin, we really struggle with this because, number one, there's inconsistency in practice. What one person thinks is a great way of sanitizing their hands is completely different to somebody else. One operator will spend literally 2 seconds, a quick spray, and then they move into the grade B, whereas another operator will spend, a good 30 seconds, 45 seconds maybe, using a completely different but probably more thorough practice. This resulted in adverse trends, and what we do in sterile manufacturing, we take very regular finger dabs. This is when the gloved hands of the operators are placed onto a microbial agar plate. That plate is incubated, and if we actually count any bacteria from those impressions, from those finger dabs, that's a pretty significant failure, and in most cases that will result in a severe deviation incident that usually, in my experience, results in a batch rejection. So it's a big deal. They actually had costly investigations because every investigation takes time, and time is money. But they had rejected literally millions of dollars worth of product as a result of finger dab failures. That's where bacteria are isolated, which they were convinced was due to inconsistency in practice in the way people were sanitizing their hands. Now, they'd gone through that usual CAPA process by saying, okay, we're going to do more training, we're going to add more checks, we're going to make the SOP bigger, and surprise, surprise, no change actually took place. So this was the proposition they put to me to say, well, okay, Martin, let's take this model that you're going to give us and let's just work through it, and let's just see in a day or so, which was the time period for the workshop, what we can generate so that we can actually really get consistency back into this crucial process so that we can stop all this wastely investigation and time wasting. Now, the first process that we went through, step 2, was to say, well, okay, let's just examine what drives this behavior. And we walked out of the training room, we went into the clean room, we observed for a good half a day, what operators were doing. This is a really, really, really critical phase because we've got to diagnose before we act. And on this particular occasion, it was done through direct observation. It was done through open discussions with the operating team using what we call the Kliene process, which is a really unique way of getting information from operators. It's a great problem-solving tool and technique because it's not an interrogation. It puts people at ease. It was originally designed actually to question pilots after near misses to try and establish, what happened, who did, what, when, and how, for the purpose of preventing those incidents happening again. So it's a particular process that we take people through in our course because it really dissociates the individual from the problem so that it allows you to focus very much on the problem rather than it becoming personal, which normally results in resistance because of the fear of blame and punishment. So, we asked the questions, there was lots of active listening, we walked the process, and this whole diagnosis is about understanding the world in which that old behavior, in this case inconsistency in hand sanitizing, what leads to that type of behavior. So the longer you spend on this, ladies and gentlemen, the better. This is what we found in summary. The operators were saying, and I said to them, guys, what's the purpose of hand spraying? Well, most of them just said, well, Martin, we do it because it says so in the SOP. We do it for compliance. We do it because that's what the regulators expect. We do it because that's what auditors like to see. So, I took a sharp intake of breath at that time because that really is lack of motivation. These guys had not been given a reason to care. So not surprisingly, inconsistencies existed. The SOP was overly complex. What we also found was that there was inconsistency in practice. Some people would spray all of their gloves, front and back. Others would spray just the fingers. Some would spray more on the left, more on the right. Often people were rushing around, and therefore the pressure resulted in people simply forgetting. In other words, it had not been habituated enough. Interestingly, on a vast majority of cases, the sanitizer, which is some companies will use pre-irradiated aerosol cans. In this particular case, the company manufactured its own IPA. It filtered the IPA, so it's sterilized through filtration into a container, a handset, very similar to those that you probably use to spray your house plants. Well, those sanitizers were never, very rarely in fact, in the same place. The SOP didn't make sense. There was no proper training. And actually the bottles used, the sanitizers used, were not particularly easy to use. So, this diagnosis phase was really, really key, because you can start to see that until we change some of these, the behavior that we want to change will actually remain. So once you've done that diagnosis, it's saying, okay, we've got the information, how are we going to actually use it? So we went through that behavior equals motivation, ability, and habit. Well, I apologize if any of you are having lunch or about to have lunch, but the process we took them through about giving them a reason to care was this. We went into the micro lab. We showed them pictures of wounds. We showed them pictures of abscesses. We made it clear to them that one organism in a susceptible patient can kill. We actually had an array of agar plates in front of them. We found really smelly organisms like Pseudomonas and Bacillus. So we got them engaged in smelling as well as looking at the colonies on the agar plates. We then actually showed them samples of creams that had been degraded, broken down by the presence of Pseudomonas. We then got them to take a finger dab without a glove on, with a glove on, sanitized and unsanitized. We got them to stick their finger in a broth. That broth was then incubated, and then the morning after they had the pleasure of smelling the broth and realizing that the few bacteria they had on their fingers had multiplied into tens of millions, quite literally, of bacteria. And at the end of the session, we did what we call the fluorescent dye test. This is a really great, immediate, very visual way of showing the risks of inconsistency in practice. So, you cover gloves in a fluorescent dye, you get people to sanitize those gloves in an attempt to remove that dye, and then using a UV, you can actually see where the dye actually is remaining, usually between the fingers, between the digits, usually on the back of the hand. And that was a really profound moment for many of these operators who usually thought that what they did was fine, and then suddenly they're confronted with the reality that their normal routine process, their normal routine procedure was actually ineffective. And then linking that back to, look, there's one or two organisms on your gloves and you are doing an intervention that is presenting significant risk to contaminating the product, and therefore presenting risk to the patient. So this was all about creating the motivation, almost a fear factor, to say, look, one organism can kill. This is what a bacteria can do if it's injected into a patient. This is what a bug looks like, smells like. This is what's on your fingers. And these are the inconsistencies in your gloving sanitization practices that can all, when you put all of those components together, present real and significant risk. Now, the challenge in creating this motivation, guys, is you can tell whether they're engaged. If you are the learning coach, if you're the trainer delivering this session, you can tell whether people get it or they do not by their facial expressions. And if they're not getting it, if they're still not shocked, if they're still not motivated to change, then try something else. But do not go on to the next stage unless you really are absolutely convinced that you've given them enough information to care. So that's the motivation phase. So we've identified the specific behavior, which is to clean our hands, sanitize our hands correctly. We've understood, number 2, what drives the old behavior. Number 3, we've done the best we can at giving them a reason for caring, giving them a reason for undergoing that painful process of learning a new behavior, that new pattern of behavior that we talked about on the last webinar. Then we move on to number 4, which is to focus on making sure they have the ability to do this new behavior no matter what pressure. And these are the actions that are very simple actions, in fact, that the group identified as really, really key. The first thing they did was to standardize the method by which gloves were sanitized. They took a few hours to do this, and their reference point was the fluorescent dye test. Because out of the 15 operators who participated in this study, who participated in the lab work, there were 2 operators who consistently had no fluorescent dye left on their gloves. So what I said to the remaining group was, okay guys, just watch and observe. What do they do differently that the rest of you are not doing? And how can we simplify that even further? Because remember, to habituate, the process needs to be kept simple. And they actually developed and they called it their license to kill. They identified 5 key, very simple steps in a certain sequence, in a certain order, to be followed when gloves were to be sanitized, and steps that were proven to be effective. The users then designed their own checklist, and I do mean it was really simple in that and it was called their license to kill, and it had just 5 bullet points. Because remember from our last session, the working brain, the prefrontal cortex, can only remember 7 facts plus or minus 2. So you've got to keep it really simple, really punchy, and then it is easy to remember, and then it's easy to habituate. They then said, well, Martin, we've done that now. Now we're going to fix the locations, because one of the problems they had before is that they left the grade A area with all of the best intentions of sanitizing their hands, only to then be distracted by the fact that the bottle was not where it should be. Because any of you who've worked in the grade A, grade B area know that people have a habit of spraying their hands and sort of putting the bottle down on the nearest surface, and clearly that causes a distraction, and that led to inconsistency in practice. So they decided, right, that bottle is always going to be fixed at that location, and we will always put it back there so we always know where to go. They then tackled the next factor they identified, which is redesign of the bottle, because they understood that actually it wasn't easy to depress, it wasn't easy to use, and that put operators off using it as frequently and as appropriately as they should have been. So you can see with the ability components of the motivation equals behavior equals motivation, ability, and habituation equation. They really took all of the information from that diagnostic phase and then factored it into providing the ability, because remember, ability is not just knowledge, it's actually removing the barriers that prevent the new behavior from being used, but also to prevent the old behavior from being coming back. Because as we mentioned in the last webinar on quality habits, the strongest behavior is always the one where the habit is strongest, and under conditions of stress and pressure, it is always the strongest pattern of behavior that will actually re-emerge. So, on occasions you have to engineer out the old behavior in order to give the new behavior a chance of surviving long enough so that it eventually becomes stronger. So when you look down through these 4 points, standardize the method, design a simple user design checklist, standardize the locations, and redesign the bottle, you can understand how important that diagnosis phase is. Then you go into the bit that is the habit-forming component of the behavioral equation, which is often neglected because this takes time. Because we've got to create a habit where, by definition, people act without thinking. And you're all experts now, that habit loop. I'm sure you've changed lots of your own habits now. You're drinking less beer because you replaced the Q, that's the beer in the fridge, with the water in the fridge instead. And you have a different routine and you have a different reward. So I'm sure you've all practiced those. But that habit loop is really, really key because we use those components to embed this new behavior. And what they did was really, really clever because it was really, really simple. On the glass panel of each of the laminar airflow, they had a red sticker in the shape of a sanitizing bottle on every laminar airflow cabinet. So clearly they were constantly exposed to this sticker, and that acted as the cue. That acted as the immediate reminder as they were walking to the laminar airflow, they could see the sticker, and that subconsciously was saying, just remember, when you leave, you need to sanitize. They would work for, would it be 10 or 15 minutes, they would see the sticker again, it triggered them, it was a reminder, remember, you've got to sanitize. The sanitizers were also, the bottles were also colored red, so that trigger continued, and the bottles that were previously colorless really, and against a white vinyl background, they didn't really stick out that much and they were easy to lose. So the operators decided, look, we need them more visible, let's make it the same color, and let's actually agree on a standard location that these will always be in. So no chances of missing them, no distractions, no opportunity for bad practice creeping in. And then right next to the sanitized would be the checklist, the license to kill. That's the routine component of the habit-forming loop. And this was the checklist that came from the lab studies that said, remember, this is the way that you do it in order to remove all of that dye. In other words, get rid of all of those bacteria that could cause risk to the patients. And again, 5 easy steps, not 7 or 8, 9 or 10, just 5 easy steps. Any more, it simply won't work. And then to strengthen that habit, that relied upon coaching and mentoring and feedback, not necessarily through supervisors, but through the professionalism and the integrity of the operators who now have the motivation, the reason for caring to ensure that patients are protected. And then on a regular basis, they would do fluorescent, they called them the fluorescent challenge test. So at different working group sessions throughout the year, they would just do this again, and they would get the UV lamp out, and they would just re-emphasize that, guys, look, this is really, really important. It's still not working. What do we need to change? Or, as it was in this case, what they found was a dramatic improvement in consistency that actually didn't give them any adverse results with this fluorescent test. Well, the rewards, because that's the last bit of the habit loop, We've given them the Q, which is the red sticker on the laminar airflow. I say given them, they gave themselves the routine. And then finally, having removed the barriers to the old behavior, the reward, which is really, really key, because if you provide the reward, it automatically drives and strengthens the behavior. Well, these were the statistics they gave me a few weeks ago. Their reduction in SOP non-compliances was significant, well, 98% reduction. Their batch rejects, they would normally reject in the region of 3 batches a year due to concerns relating to sterility assurance, directly as a result of high finger dab failures. Well, they haven't had any since then. And, you just look at the return on the investment, because these batches ran into millions of dollars each. Deviation incidents dramatically reduced, which pleases everybody. Dramatic improvements in aseptic practice. And finally, linking it all the way back to the patient safety. I'll share with you one more story, ladies and gentlemen. I have a friend who's a surgeon in a hospital, and they had a very similar experience with doctors. This sounds horrific. Doctors not washing their hands. Now, one of the key causes of hospital-acquired infections is actually doctors simply not washing their hands. And you say to yourself, how complicated can it be? And they tried everything. They put the statistics up about, the levels of post-operative infections, levels of pre-operative infections. They put monetary values to all of that. They gave doctors training in how to wash their hands, and still nothing improved. In other words, they took the old approach. My friend said to me, Martin, you're into this sort of stuff. What do I do? And I talked him through these 5 stages, and he executed them as you would expect from a neurosurgeon who is very precise in his execution. He executed them very, very precisely. And he said, you know what? We've never actually observed what doctors do as they enter wards. We yell at them when they don't clean their hands, but we haven't actually spent any time in the diagnosis phase. So what my friend did, John, he got a chair. He sat outside one of the post-operative wards, and all he did for half a day was to observe the practice of medics at every level. And what he suddenly observed was that when doctors were entering the ward where the patients were in their beds, he said the hand sanitizer was right up on the right-hand side, and there was a big sign saying, please wash your hands before entering. And he said, Martin, what was really interesting is their eyes. I said, what do you mean their eyes? He said, well, when they're walking into the wards, these people are usually rushing, the doctors are usually overworked, and he said 90% of them were looking down. They were looking at the floor. Therefore, they were actually missing the sign saying, wash your hands. Now, you might be sat there nodding, shaking your head saying, come on, you know where the sanitizer is, therefore it's not a complicated process. But, that's an assumption. So what he actually did, very similar to what this company did, he created a trigger. In other words, he got the hospital to paint a very bright red arrow on the floor, pointing up the wall directly to the hand sanitizer. Right next to the hand sanitizer was the license to kill, 5 key points. He took them through the fluorescent dye test, which he said had a profound effect on their behavior. And then he said within literally a week, their levels of hospital-acquired infections had dramatically fallen because they had habituated the new behavior by actually thinking about what drives the old behavior. Let's make sure we have the trigger, which is the big red arrow on the floor pointing to the sanitizer with a checklist that they themselves had delivered. So just another example of the fact that you can change behaviors. Because my promise to you is this, ladies and gentlemen, why behaviours must change, and I think we're all convinced, hopefully, they must. We know what works. We've just described it. We also know what doesn't. And often we resort back to that old behaviour of let's yell at people, let's give them some more training, let's give them some more intimidating measures to drive that new behaviour. Let's add complexity to the already complex SOP. We know that doesn't work. And I hope that what I've illustrated through the very simple example I've given you is behavioural change is possible, providing you understand that behaviour boils down to motivation, the ability, and the habit component. As we said already in that mind map, it isn't quite that simple, but hey, if we can just remember those three components, we're actually a long way towards changing behaviours. Because there are lots of people out there that say to me, Martin, you know what, it's impossible to change behaviours. That's a load of rubbish, because if that was the case, we'd still be running around in loincloths and living in caves. Behavioural change is possible. The process is there. Now, there's a lot more we could have talked about, ladies and gentlemen, with regard to what influences behaviour and going back to that mind map. But I think hopefully the process that I've given you will really give you the confidence to go out there and use it, because it is simple and it is straightforward, providing you go through those steps. Identify the specific behaviour that you want to change. The more specific, the better. Go for the simple ones first, so that you cut your teeth, so to speak, on the simple ones. You get the confidence in the process. The diagnosis phase, step 2, is really, 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 really key, because then you start to understand what is underpinning the old behaviour, and therefore the types of barriers and changes to systems and equipment and processes and procedures, maybe leadership styles, that need to precede the next step, which is to say, well, okay, let's give them the reason for caring. That's the motivation. Let's make sure that we take all of that information from the diagnostic phase, step 2, into giving them the ability, because ability is not about just the training component. It's giving them the tools, giving them the systems, giving them the processes that enable them to simply follow the new behaviour. And then finally, make sure that the habituation process, in the way that we described on the last webinar, is really, really given time to embed. And this is something that we as an industry sort of tend to rush through. We said in the last webinar, look, really, really simple habits take repetitions of 20 to 30 times. More complex habits, we're into the 100s and thousands of times. So we've got to give time for people to practice, to learn from the errors and mistakes, so that they refine and improve and habituate. And that can only be done in an environment that recognizes mistakes will be made, and we are accepting of those mistakes, because the whole purpose is to learn from them rather than punish people as a result. So, ladies and gentlemen, that brings to closure the end of this session on changing workplace behaviours. Hopefully see or talk to you again on the 18th of May. I said I'd promise to stay out of any restaurants before then, or at least if I do go, I'll certainly make the right risk-based decisions. So I hope you found this really useful. And as I've constantly said on all of our sessions, please use this information, go out and spread the word, share our passion, because with this information, and the whole purpose of these webinars is to enable your organizations and your businesses to thrive in what is going to be a very, very challenging environment. So on that note, thank you very much, everyone. Have a great week. And lastly, can you please provide me with any feedback on the session, because I do take that feedback very seriously, and we will use it to improve future sessions. Thank you, everyone, and as I say, have a great week.